Turning now to politics, President Biden returning from his trip abroad to a lot of headwinds in his own party, clearly with declining poll numbers and a shellacking in this week's elections. He faces mounting pressure to pass his agenda, get things moving. Joining us now to break it all down for us is Caroline Heldman. Caroline, good morning. Again, here we are talking about big headwinds for the president. What should be the first order of business for him after what can only be called a rebuke of his presidency?
Well, the first order of business has to be to pass the budget bill in the House, and it looks as though that is happening. We see some movement yesterday to move this committee forward in the process. Two big things, too. The paid family leave that was removed is now back in the bill, as well as the prescription drug support. It'll be interesting to see what happens when it hits the Senate, because Joe Manchin has said he doesn't want those elements in the bill, and he also says that the bill is still too big. So let's see what happens next.
Before we even go into that, not passing the infrastructure, not passing anything, giving him something to brag about, or the Democratic contenders something to brag about, how badly did it hurt him in these races?
Definitely hurt the Democrats. The shellacking, as you called it, that's the word I've been using as well. There's always a swing when you have midterm elections, and in this case, an off midterm election. There's always a swing against the party in power, but this really was a massive swing. We saw unexpected losses in San Antonio, Philadelphia, certainly in Virginia, even some lower ticket races in New Jersey. This was not what the Democrats expected. And yes, it has a lot to do with the fact that they are seen as inefficient right now at the federal level.
Well, they were able to eke out a win in New Jersey, but that was way closer than anybody had ever expected. Why do you think that turned blue in the end?
Well, it should never have been that close. I mean, this was a state that Biden won by around 15 points a year ago, right? So how is it that you have this massive swing? At the end of the day, the Republicans are out messaging the Democrats, and they are also out energizing their base. Republicans are much more motivated in this election, and I think we'll see this higher level of energy and motivation going into the 2022 midterm elections.
Well, Caroline, what do you think the Democrats should most take away from this shellacking? That the party is much more centrist, or the nation, the Democrats in the nation are much more centrist than they are progressive, and that the party needs to now shift accordingly?
Well, I think one big takeaway is that their messaging is not effective. It is not enough now to just say, I'm against Donald Trump, and try to align every single candidate with Donald Trump. As we saw in Virginia, Youngkin did an incredible job distancing himself from Trump while holding many of his extreme policies, right? So this is a candidate who is against abortion rights. This is a candidate who used the manufactured critical race theory, fear-mongering tactic. This is a candidate who looks a lot like Donald Trump, but feels much calmer. And that will be the playbook for Republicans. If the Democrats are smart about this, they need to win the messaging wars. And the very first thing they need to do is stop talking about these national pieces of legislation in technical terms. They need to talk about them in terms of how they actually affect everyday lives and everyday Americans.
Do you think that Youngkin was able to somehow create a new archetype for the leaders of the Republican Party that shows also that the Trump fever is somehow breaking?
Absolutely. I mean, he is the answer to the Republicans who want to appeal to the Trump base, but don't want to re-elevate Trump in the next presidential election. Youngkin is definitely that prototype, and I think that he will have a long life in Republican politics, as well as anyone else who manages to straddle both having those policy positions, but presenting them in a gentler manner.
And the winners, the pundits say, will be the ones now that are able to then get the independent support. You agree?
I do agree. We saw a pretty big independent swing. Again, not enough to just be against Donald Trump. You have to be for something. I think if the Democrats pass this infrastructure and budget bill pair, that they will have something to talk about for the next, year, and we'll hear much about it. But if they talk about it in technical terms, they're going to lose independents. They're certainly going to lose members of their own party. They have to talk about it in terms of how it affects Americans, and especially how it will affect them economically, because that was the #1 issue in this election.
The Democrats are always accused of having lousy messaging, where the right has really learned to weaponize some of the cultural issues at play here. What do the Democrats need to do? Some pundits said they acted as if there was just some normal times and normal elections, and they should have gone after a defense of democracy against January 6th. Do you think there was lots of missteps here?
I do. I think that the Democrats always have terrible messaging. And as someone who has helped with messaging on both sides of the political aisle, you've hit the nail on the head, Giselle, that there are missed opportunities. And also, Democrats like to talk about policy in very technical terms, in very professorial terms. That's not what actually resonates with people. So I think, the Democrats are really going to have to stand for something and not just against Donald Trump heading into these 2022 midterms.
And do you think it will be enough for the midterms for the president to pass his infrastructure agendas? It seems like he still can't unify the party. Joe Manchin seems to be pretty entrenched in his position still.
I think the number one issue that will determine whether or not the midterms go well for Democrats is the economy. In these off-election years, there's always a big swing. And I think it's important to note historically that if the president's approval rating is below 50%, if they are underwater, then the average swing is 37 seats. Right now, there are only 8 seats in the House of Representatives between Democrats and Republicans. So I would not at all be surprised that if the Democrats lose their majority in the House and possibly even the Senate, but the economy will be the primary determinant.
And with inflation right now on the rise and the cost of goods skyrocketing for the holidays, not looking good. Thank you, Caroline. We'll be back.